physical performance. Again, from everything from squatting more to feeling better in your yoga class to having more energy throughout the day, to our third major bucket that we've been talking about throughout this entire series, which are longevity. So we can cover those first if you'd like to start there.
Yes, absolutely. Let's start there.
Oftentimes when we think of supplements, we immediately jump to high sport performance type of things or vigorous workouts or muscle building, though that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Take, for example, creatine. And I've spoken about this at length and with Darren Kandow, who's done a tremendous amount of research. I was just up at his lab recently in Canada, and he has covered extensively. In fact, I think I put up a post, perhaps I could draw this up, where he laid out all the myriad of benefits of creatine. This is taken in the typically 3 to 5 grams per day of dose of creatine monohydrate, which has the most research behind it. Seems to be extremely low side effects in almost anyone. And the benefits include, of course, things like muscle performance and strength and things like that. And if you go back to our discussion in our episode on metabolism and endurance, we talked about the phosphocreatine system. So you can figure out kind of what this is going to do in terms of effect. That said, there's excellent information and data coming out now on the benefits of bone mineral density in creatine. There's a ton of work looking at a host of cognitive factors, from memory, executive function, to effects potentially on even things like depression, mood, to Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, all forms of neurodegenerative disease. In fact, it's pretty obvious. The brain loves creatine as a fuel. And so not only, we sort of discussed it in the episode as being the fuel for skeletal muscle contraction, but the brain needs to do that as well. The astrocytes around the brain need to be able to provide energy, et cetera. So it's very clear that metabolism in the brain is reduced with things like TBI and potentially concussions. So now, to be extremely clear, creatine does not prevent any of those diseases. It does not treat any of them, and the data are mixed, but more and more are coming. Some show a little bit of benefit, some show maybe none, but I'm not aware of any research in those areas that show it has any downside. For the most part, side effects are extremely minimal, if not null, and then potentially some benefit, depending on the specific study. So we could put up if you'd like, a couple of links directly to those meta-analyses, and folks can go through those things one by one. So I only say that to, again, maybe expand our understanding or thinking about what these types of supplements can do. It's not just about growing muscle or high performance. It's everything to, again, there's an association with recovery. So creatine is fantastic for recovery from muscle damage. Helps and can potentially aid in fat loss and a whole host of things. So you can actually also even look at websites like examine.com. I have no affiliation with them whatsoever, but if you want to just type in something like creatine monohydrate, you can see a whole list, and you're going to see thousands of studies of the potential benefits of creatine. So that is always number one on my list.
I'm relieved to hear that creatine sits at the top of your supplementation list because, first of all, I started taking it when I was in college. At that time, I was taking it in this kind of loading mode where you take it in, anywhere from 15 to 25 grams per day, often causing some gastric distress, often combining it with fruit juice to try and shuttle it into the muscles.
Sure.
And then a so-called maintenance phase of reducing to 10 or 15 grams per day. Nowadays, I just take about 5 grams or so, although later I know you're going to tell me why I should probably be taking more than 5 grams per day, given my body weight. So I know we'll get into some of those specifics a little bit later. But in addition to experiencing direct effects on muscle size and strength, which I did, I don't know how it contributed to my cognitive function or if it does now, because there's really no way to tease that out with standard at-home tests like a scale. But it is very clear to me based on the literature that you described and some of which we've covered on other episodes of the podcast, that the phosphocreatine system is vitally important for forebrain function, right? The forebrain, of course, being the portion of brain, broadly speaking, the portion of brain just behind your forehead that is responsible for planning, action, setting rules and context. So even as simple as if you're going downfield in a game of soccer or basketball and you're on offense, and then you make an attempt on goal or basket, and then it switches, and you go back. Now you're on defense. Being on defense is very different than being on offense. And that that rule switching is a prefrontal cortical function, as is every context-dependent way of thinking or acting. And so anything that can favor function of the forebrain, I think is good for humans in general. It suppresses anxiety, allows us to interpret what's going on for us. And so I'm very relieved and gratified to hear that creatine sits at the top of the list. Also, as I'm sure you'll point out again later, creatine is for the most part a relatively affordable supplement for most people. So here we're not talking about something that's really esoteric or that you have to, fly to some remote location to get an infusion of.
Right.
But
although I apologize to all you because I know the price has skyrocketed recently.
Really?
Yeah.
Why is that?
I think it's nobody knows, but it's quote unquote a supply and demand issue, if you will. So those prices have gone up. There's also, of course, been shipping problems in the world and things. So every time I talk about creatine right now, people just flame me for like, oh my God, it's so expensive now. I'm like, I know, I'm sorry, but honestly, it's only so expensive because you're used to being so cheap. So when you counter the fact that you're like,
right.
Yeah, like relative to the other stuff you're probably taking, relative to any other number of purchases, it still lands very high on my ROI list, my 80/20 because of that. It can be taken any time of the day. It doesn't have to be in magical combination. You talked about co-ingesting with carbohydrates. That can enhance how quickly you can get into the system. In fact, it's going to work on the exact same mechanisms we'll probably or potentially talk about in hydration. But these things are shuttled. So anytime you bring in carbohydrate, that's going to be shipped into tissue as quickly as it can. Creatine then goes along for the ride, and then it brings water for the ride. That's how you enhance hydration. That's why it's important to have carbohydrates when you're trying to hydrate. So you're just going to take it in there, and that's also why you get quote-unquote cell swelling, which is a good thing. It's just enhancing hydration. We actually use it a ton in our post-weigh-in protocols. So in individuals that have to cut water weight, creatine's a great thing to throw back in there. It's going to help you rehydrate. It's also why when you take 30 grams of it, it can pull a bunch of fluid in the intestines, and there you go with your little bit of GI distress. So, there's a lot of fun things you can talk about there. I just had to flag that because every time I've been talking about it recently and I say it's cheap, people are killing me for it. So I apologize. I don't know how to make it any cheaper, but it's still fairly affordable.
Yeah, I would say relatively inexpensive compared to a lot of supplements out there. And when thinking about the return on investment, it's quite good.
Yeah, and so actually, sorry to cut you off, but I was just also thinking, there's been a number of studies on sleep deprivation as well with creatine that can help. So obviously sleep deprivation will generally reduce cognitive function, and creatine can ameliorate some of that drop. So if you think about it in that context, I had a crummy night of sleep. And if that enables you to perform a little bit better in your job, then you would make up the $1 or so, whatever you paid for that day's supply of creatine. So it is something kind of on that note. It's not going to work as an acute response. So it's not something you're like, I feel terrible, let me throw some creatine down the hatch, I'll feel better. That's not going to work. It's going to take several weeks to have a noticeable effect. It needs to be stored in tissue. It needs to be built up before you can actually do much of anything. So it is unlike some of the other things like stimulants or caffeine that have an acute response right now. And so if you're going to take it, you probably need to consume it consistently. If you can't do that, then really there's no point in doing it. And the loading phase you mentioned, distance we're here, is something you can do, again, if you need to enhance the storage of it really quickly. So say, for example, we've done this in some military cases where it's like you get back to base and you've only got a week and then you got to go back out. We may actually have to do a little bit of a loading phase then. But if that's not the case, the loading phase is unnecessary. It's not really harmful other than maybe GI stress and maybe waste, but you're going to have 3 or 4 weeks. It's going to reach full saturation, plenty of time to be there in that, if you're in that 3 to 7 grams per day range.
I'm glad you mentioned the slow accumulating positive effects of creatine as compared to so-called acute effects, because the way that I think of health promoting and performance enhancing protocols like viewing morning sunlight or endurance exercise for that matter, or creatine or sleep, for instance, is that while they can have effects in the immediate term, you might feel a little bit, or in the case of a good night's sleep, a lot better. It's really the cumulative effect of raising your baseline level of functioning. There's another way to think about it is these supplements or behaviors and quality nutrition, when done consistently over time, and that doesn't mean 100% of the time, but probably 80% of the time,
sure,
lead to a sort of buoyancy in your system that allows you to be more resilient under conditions where conditions aren't perfect, right? And if conditions are made perfect or close to perfect and you already have that buoyancy, that's when you really start to see the ultra high performance effects that are so much fun. But they have to be established through consistent supplementation, consistent nutritional intake. So today I know we're going to distinguish between normally they're called chronic and acute effects, but that makes it sound like chronic illness. The moment people hear chronic, well, they might think of other things, but in the context of health, they typically think of, chronic illness, and we're not talking about that. What we're talking about is slow modulatory effects in the body. A lot of things in the body take time to build up, but once they've built up, they clearly can benefit us. And then other things, as you mentioned, a stimulant, for instance, has a very acute effect that is going to occur with, peak within 30 minutes and wear off within, 4 hours or so. Can also have some chronic effects, but typically it's a short-lived effect. So we just want to frame up the language that we'll be using, and I'm really excited to dive into this topic. And I think creatine is a beautiful example of a supplement that has positive, chronic, mental, and physical benefits.
Down the road, I can come back and talk a little bit more about creatine, and we can cover some other information regarding best practices for getting the most out of it, as well as we'll certainly dive into some of the common side effects, or at least a thought of side effects. While we're here, though, I also could throw in a few other of these high-impact, low-cost, generally safe, things that are my 80-20 rule, if you will. So the way I actually kind of think about it is you want one from each of three categories. And these categories are fuel, stimulant, and fatigue blockers. So creatine is actually in the fuel. It's not a stimulant. As we talked about, it's a chronic effect there. So we've already knocked that one off. Another one from the fatigue blocker is going to be anything like beta-alanine or sodium bicarbonate. And then from the stimulant use, of course, we have anything like a beetroot juice to a caffeine or something of the equivalent. So we can come back again and talk about all those in more detail a little bit later.
Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is also separate from Dr. Andy Galpin's teaching and research roles at Cal State Fullerton. It is, however, part of our desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, we'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Our first sponsor is Momentous. Momentous makes supplements of the absolute highest quality. The Huberman Lab podcast is proud to be partnering with Momentous for several important reasons. First of all, as I mentioned, their supplements are of extremely high quality. Second of all, their supplements are generally in single ingredient formulations. If you're going to develop a supplementation protocol, you're going to want to focus mainly on using single ingredient formulations. With single ingredient formulations, you can devise the most logical and effective and cost-effective supplementation regimen for your goals. In addition, Momentous supplements ship internationally. And this is, of course, important because we realize that many of the Huberman Lab podcast listeners reside outside the United States. If you'd like to try the various supplements mentioned on the Huberman Lab podcast, in particular supplements for hormone health, for sleep optimization, for focus, as well as a number of other things, including exercise recovery, you can go to Live Momentous, spelled O-U-S, so that's livemomentous.com/Huberman. Today's episode is also brought to us by Levels. Levels is a program that lets you see how different foods and activities affect your health by giving you real-time feedback on your blood glucose using a continuous glucose monitor. Many people are aware that their blood sugar, that is their blood glucose level, is critical for everything from fat loss to muscle gain to healthy cognition and indeed aging of the brain and body. Most people do not know, however, how different foods and different activities, including exercise or different temperatured environments, impact their blood glucose levels. And yet blood glucose is exquisitely sensitive to all of those things. I first started using Levels about a year ago as a way to understand how different foods, exercise, and timing of food relative to exercise and quality of sleep at night impact my blood glucose levels. And I've learned a tremendous amount from using Levels. It's taught me when best to eat, what best to eat, when best to exercise, how best to exercise, and how to modulate my entire schedule from work to exercise and even my sleep. So if you're interested in learning more about Levels and trying a continuous glucose monitor yourself, go to levels.link/Huberman. That's levels.link/Huberman. Today's episode is also brought to us by Element. Element is an electrolyte drink that contains the exact ratios of the electrolytes sodium, magnesium, and potassium to optimize cellular functioning for mental and physical performance. Most people realize that hydration is key. We need to ingest enough fluids in order to feel our best and perform our best. But what most people do not realize is that the proper functioning of our cells and nerve cells, neurons in particular, requires that sodium, magnesium, and potassium be present in the correct ratios. Now, of course, people with prehypertension and hypertension need to be careful about their sodium intake. But what a lot of people don't realize is that if you drink caffeine, if you exercise, and in particular, if you're following a very clean diet, that is not a lot of processed foods, which of course is a good thing, chances are you're not getting enough sodium, potassium, and magnesium to optimize mental and physical performance. Element contains a science-backed ratio of 1,000 milligrams, that's 1 gram of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium, and no sugar. If you'd like to try Element, you can go to Drink Element, that's lmnt.com/Huberman.